Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you to discuss this very important topic today. You know, we're witnessing a heightened interest in global food security as a result of the pandemic, but now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the threats have multiplied in so many different ways. And so I want to applaud the Atlantic Council and all of our sponsors for bringing this important topic to bear. I'm joined today by two distinguished experts. To my far left, Dr. Carrie Fowler, who is the Special Envoy for Global Food Security at the U.S. State Department, and Michael Scannell, who is the Deputy Director-General for Agriculture and Rural Development at the European Commission, who's had a 30-year or so distinguished career there. So we've got a great opportunity to have a discussion here. I'd love to hear your questions as well. So if you do have a question after I start asking a few, please raise your hand, try to catch my eye. And then also, for those of you who are online, you can enter questions in the Q&A portion of your online Zoom. Or if you're on Twitter, you can enter the hashtag EUDFF22. So there's lots of ways to engage, and we're looking forward to having a very robust discussion. So as I mentioned, as a journalist, I have lots of questions of my own, so we'll start with a few there. For both of you, we've got, as I mentioned, so many different challenges right now with the Black Sea ports being blocked, with trouble getting grains and even some of the summer harvest that's coming up out of Ukraine. We've got literally bombs in fields. I mean, the list goes on and on. So how do you prioritize the challenges, both longer term and what we need to do right now as you look at trying to help these Ukrainian farmers who are doing their very level best in the most extreme circumstances? Mr. Scannell, can I start with you?
Well, I think we start with helping our Ukrainian friends, and especially their farmers, to basically ship the existing grains that are blocked in silos in Ukraine. This is essential, essentially, to allow them to earn revenues to pay for seeds, fertilizers for the next sowing, and essentially to empty their silos in anticipation of the next harvest. So that's our first and immediate priority, and we're working very determinedly in that direction. It's not an easy task. We have to essentially find alternatives to the Ukrainian Black Sea ports, which are closed because of the war. And those alternatives have to be found very urgently. So we're looking to all the options, whether it's through rail, road, and barge, and a combination of all three, working very closely with the Ukrainian authorities themselves, obviously, but also with the neighboring EU member states. It's a huge task, but we're encouraged with the progress we've made to date. We have a specific so-called Solidarity Corridor network established, and we're pouring a lot of time, resources, and efforts into it. Obviously, we started from a situation where literally all trade had stopped in March, but already we're seeing good progress. So for example, last month we saw up to 1.8 million tons of grains moved. In the month of June, it could be anything up to 2.5 tons. Now this falls far short of the 5 to 6 million tons that could be moved if the Black Sea ports were available, but nonetheless, it's going in the right direction, and those efforts will continue. Looking to the long term, obviously we have to look at improving the resilience of agri-food production systems in general, not just in Europe, but in Ukraine itself and globally. And that we're doing with our partners, including the US.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Fowler, how about your thoughts on that question?
Well, I think the quick answer to your question about how do we balance the short term and the long term is not easily, particularly in a crisis situation like we have now. It strikes me, though, that if you, of course, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, we were already in the midst of what we probably could have called a world food crisis anyway. So this is built on top of that and exacerbated all the existing problems that we had. I think when you look at the current acute crisis that we face, you have to say to yourself, and you have to get into the mindset that this is a 3-year crisis. So if you think about, well, what can we do today to solve this crisis, or today to solve it this year, I'm not sure that's the right question to be asking, because I think short term in this situation equals 3 years, and that does bring up some very difficult questions for governments. Among them being, what can we do within this 3-year period that we typically might be thinking of as a long-term solution to improve food production, to make fertilizer use more efficient, et cetera, that will actually reap benefits, pay dividends within that 3-year period, because we see increasing humanitarian needs, which are taxing governments already. So we need to be thinking very carefully both about our humanitarian aid and how that might be helpful in terms of more sustainable approaches to creating food security, as well as something that's going to be helpful today.
So when you talk about a 3-year outlook on these challenges, still as in the short term, we know that as you mentioned, issues with rail, trying to move by rail, trying to get product out. Can we drill down a little bit just on what are some of those more specific things that we can do in the shorter term? For example, we reported this morning that we are sending large bags of grain for storage. And you know, some of those are only 5,000 tons, some are 20,000 tons. The good news is that some of those grains can be stored, but still trying to get them moved. And you mentioned the rail, the different gauges of rail lines. So how do we overcome even some of those short-term challenges of trying to get that product moved?
Let me give you one practical example. One alternative to the Black Sea ports in Ukraine that we're currently looking at is essentially making use of the Black Sea ports in Romania itself. But that involves using the so-called Channel, which is basically a connection via the Danube to the Romanian Black Sea port of Constanța. But the current shipping requirements on the Channel essentially restrict the number of vessels that can use it in any given day, 5 to 6 vessels. But by, let's say, lengthening the operating hours in the channel, and by speeding up the transit of the ships, both under safe circumstances, we aim, working with the Romanian authorities, to double the number of ships that can use that channel. And that would, frankly, hugely increase the capacity to move those grains to Constanța. Now, it'll be another issue again in speeding up the loading of grains at the port itself, but again, that's an issue we're working on. Similarly, we're working with the national rail authorities in all EU member states to see to what extent we can make use of the Adriatic ports, the Black Sea ports outside of Ukraine again, the Baltic ports, and even in certain cases, the North Sea ports in Germany, and just to ensure that we're ticking all the boxes, even the Atlantic ports. So we're looking to the availability of rail stock, scheduling, permits, and a very important point, drivers. There are skills shortages in a lot of these areas. We need more pilots for the barges, etc. So essentially we're working very, very hard to very, very quickly to ramp up the level, the volumes of grains that can be moved. And I already pointed to the figures. They're rising exponentially, but we can't hide, it's a huge challenge. You simply cannot overnight replace the Ukrainian Black Sea ports. These were geared up and equipped to move huge volumes of grains. Finding alternatives in the short term is very, very challenging, but that's the task we're setting ourselves.
And I'm sure the logistics challenge applied to the humanitarian aid as well, trying to get the right food, the right needs, the right places. How are you working on some of those logistical challenges in terms of humanitarian aid?
Well, as Michael alluded, the entire situation in the Ukraine is different now. You have to start with the fact that the Ukrainian infrastructure for food exports was all directed towards Odessa, 90-95%, maybe more of the grain exports were going out through Odessa. So you now have to imagine that none of it is going out through Odessa right now. It's all going by truck or by rail. And that presents, as Michael said, a huge challenge, but it also presents a challenge coming in. And we, going the opposite direction, and we have to realize that that Russia has targeted a good bit of the infrastructure, and there's nothing in the Ukraine that's totally safe right now. So we've been working, for example, with the European Commission, with the Ukrainians on storage facilities. There's some 20 to 25 million metric tons of grain in storage from the previous harvest. We've got corn coming in later this summer in September, October. Where is it going to go? You have to realize that farmers that can't sell the grain that's in storage now are under somewhat of a disincentive to keep on planting more and more. So, you know, this has presented huge issues, and every one of these issues, I'm sorry to say, doesn't have a simple solution. They're all complicated. Even the storage question, which you might think is fairly simple. Well, we can move in these large bags that you sometimes see in rural areas and store the grain. But how is the grain going to be harvested? Is there enough fuel? Are there enough farm workers to do that? What's the moisture content of the grain that goes into storage, and what's the temperature at which it will be stored? All of these things determine how long you can store the grain. And that's a big issue. If you want to get the grain moving out, you have a timetable of when it must go out, so you have some place to put the incoming grain. So all of these things are playing together, and it's a new situation for everyone.
Yeah, one that we didn't think we would have to face in our lifetime, I'm sure. One of the topics that you addressed in a way, but I want to drill down a little bit more on, is just the need for fuel in the right places. Well, of course, the Army needs that as well. So what things are being done to try to coordinate getting additional fuel into the farmers' hands so they do have an ability to harvest and then go into next year's planting?
Well, this issue has already arisen literally in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak of this war. The Ukrainian authorities identified a critical need for fuel for their spring sowing season. And they had a good look that my commissioner in Brussels, Commissioner Wojciechowski, he's Polish, and he picked up the phone and spoke to the Polish Prime Minister, and to make a very long story short, he secured access for the Ukrainian authorities to the Polish Strategic Reserve. So that essentially allowed the spring sowing to be completed without any critical fuel shortages. Now, the Ukrainian authorities have identified a further need for the next several weeks, and we're working hard with them on that. But they themselves are very aware of the critical necessity to ensure that their farmers have available to them fuel, because without fuel, obviously, there's nothing to drive the tractors, the harvesters, etc., etc. But in their overall list of priorities, it hasn't featured, let's say, with the same degree of urgency as it did earlier in the year. Solutions have been found and will be found to ensuring that they have these critical fuels available to them. It's not going to be easy. Again, nobody can pretend that overnight solutions can be found to all these issues, but there's huge energy, drive, resources, and solidarity going in to give them what they need to keep their farming operations running. It's critical not just for Ukraine itself, but for Europe and global food security. Basically, these grains have to access global markets, and Ukrainian farmers need the revenues from those sales to basically stay in operation. Mm-hmm. And basically we all have a shared interest in that they succeed in that huge challenge.
Yeah, and I think it's worth adding too that, at least to Mr. Putin, any fuel coming into the Ukraine could be considered as a legitimate target. The excuse being that it's going to the Ukrainians' defense efforts. So it presents a lot of challenges.
Absolutely. Well, it's good to know that there have been there's been progress made on that as well. One of the things that has come up oftentimes as we look at high prices around the globe for major commodities and sometimes shortages is that you do get countries that sometimes want to reduce or block international trade. Dr. Fowler, could you talk to us just a little bit and have both of you enter into this dialogue about how do we encourage countries that keeping free and open trade during these difficult times is still the best option?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have seen problems in this regard during this particular Russia-Ukraine crisis. There are probably 20 countries or more that have employed some types of restrictions over exports. We've seen some hoarding of grains, also fertilizer. How do we deal with that? Well, certainly the implications of that are that it gives a lot more volatility to international markets than you would ordinarily have. You can't plan for that very well, and markets can't deal with it in a very rational way. So, the main solution to that, if there is one, is that we have to have discussions with those countries, and I can promise you we are, to try to explain to them the reasons why we shouldn't be having export restrictions on these kind of vital materials, particularly in this kind of situation. And I think that's actually paying some dividends. We've seen restrictions come off, and in some cases, I think we can declare victory by not seeing other restrictions go on.
Seems to be a good way of looking at it. Would you like to add to that?
Well, there's not a lot to add. I think the message is well understood because we know from the experience of previous crises in commodity markets that restrictions on trade have made bad situations worse. And the message that's been passed globally, and this comes from G7, G20, even the WTO 12th Ministerial in Geneva last week, in its declaration on food security made a very strong point that restrictions on trade were to be avoided. So I think everybody knows and understands that, because in a mutually interdependent global trading framework, if everybody plays that game, frankly, everybody loses. So as I say, the message is well understood. There have been a few instances where individual countries have put in place restrictions, but frankly, I think the message is clear and everybody is conscious that basically the common interest is served by allowing trade to continue to flow, and hopefully that will be maintained, because the damage it would do to sentiment if countries didn't play by the rules would be very, very serious.
Yeah. As of at least a couple of years ago, 131 out of 196 countries in the world were net food importers. And one of the things that a particular crisis like we're experiencing today should teach us is certainly the importance of local in-country food production, but it also teaches us the importance of trade to balance out those supply-demand issues that we face every year, and it teaches us the importance of aid as well. All of those three things, local production, trade, and aid, have to be functioning well. And we live in such an interdependent world in terms of food that dislocations in one seem to have a ripple effect and affect everyone.
And as you look at that, and you look at the map around the globe, where do you see the biggest concerns about hunger and malnutrition as a result of this, Dr. Fowler? I've had friends who have said that, so much of this is going to impact countries that were already on the verge of disaster and had been reliant on imports of wheat, especially from Ukraine. Can you detail some of the regions where you think there's the biggest concern over global food access?
Yeah, sure. Well, about 60% of the chronically undernourished people in the world are living in countries that have a chronic problem with conflict. So we have to factor in conflict into this equation. 80% of the children who are stunted are living in conflict zones. That's a real problem. I think, though, if you want to look at geographic areas, certainly the Horn of Africa, which is experiencing a terrible drought, historic proportions. You have to look at Saharan Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America. There are some bright spots out there, but those would, the Middle East, those are the areas that I think we have to pay close attention to right now.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a couple more questions that I've planned, but I'd really love to hear from anybody in the audience who has a question. So please, I'm going to ask one more here, and then we'll have a microphone come on over to you. So thank you. I guess my last question has to do with inflation. I mean, it's one thing that we're seeing these spikes in commodity prices, but really all around the globe, we seem to be trying to find new ways to battle these inflationary pressures that we're dealing with. Obviously, the U.S. government has taken some action, the Europeans have taken some action. So what do you see as the impact of not only the war, but the inflationary pressures, and how are they perhaps interrelated as we look ahead?
Well, I think traditionally energy and food tended to be, let's say, separated from the usual price indices for the very good reason that prices of both tend to fluctuate rather wildly. And so there had been an expectation as recently as 6 months ago that recent inflationary trends would ease for precisely this reason. That hasn't proven to be the case. So an issue that impacts on food and energy has implications for inflationary pressures globally. And this is hugely complicating the tasks of monetary authorities. And of course, the big risk is that if inflationary expectations become embedded in the economy, we'll relive the experience of the 1970s, in part at that time also linked to energy. And obviously, that's something to be avoided. Inflation is hugely disruptive to our economies, and it's extremely painful in lowering inflation. So extremely important that basically we get back to a stable price climate where basically businesses, consumers don't have to worry about inflation. But as we can see from markets currently, as we can see from stock markets, bond markets, there are big concerns out there. And food is extremely important in that context because all consumers, especially those on low incomes, are especially impacted by increases in food prices. And this is even more the case for developing countries because they spend an awful lot more of their disposable income on food. So we really essentially have to try and get back to stable prices and lower inflation in the food area. And that's why the consequences of this Russian war on Ukraine are so serious, because they have really added fuel to the fire in that rise in commodity food prices that took place even before the outbreak of this war.
I started my journalism career in the late 70s, early 80s when interest rates were skyrocketing, farmers were going out of business, committing suicide. I don't want to repeat that again, and I'm sure most other people don't either. Dr. Fowler, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you were watching the global commodity markets just before the Russian invasion, you would have seen the price of wheat spike up just some days before the invasion. I think the grain trade was anticipating what was about to happen. It's leveled off a little bit, but still much higher than it was last year. But I think we also have to realize that, at least in the food space, we're dealing with a number of issues that are having an impact on inflation that are not issues that can be easily solved with the snap of a finger. We're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with COVID and supply chain problems, and we're dealing with conflict. We also have historically low grain stockpiles, and we're in the middle of we're in the high point of a cycle for fertilizer prices. So if you really wanted to have a huge impact on food prices, you'd probably have to be dealing with all of those. And unfortunately, that's rather difficult and can't be done overnight. So that's why I said a few minutes ago that I think we're dealing with a multi-year crisis, and we ought to plan in that regard.
Yeah, no quick solutions. So we had a question over here. If you can wait for the mic, and then please tell us your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Leah Lucis. I'm a summer associate for the Joint Baltic American National Committee. I'm very grateful for all of you coming and sharing your expertise. I was very grateful for Ms. Wyant for bringing up already malnutrition in existing countries and chronic malnutrition. This is a two-part question, but first I was wondering, is there any work in place to explore how we can best assist those countries, underdeveloped countries, developing countries that are already suffering from malnutrition? Is there a fear that there's going to be an outbid for grain as grain becomes more desirable and it has a higher demand? And additionally, are we globally doing anything to support the farmers that are producing that grain right now? We talked briefly about oil to export that grain, but are we ensuring that the farmers and the workers working on those farms are keeping grain for their nutritional needs? Are they getting the fertilizer resources? And are there global works in place to make sure that's all happening? I understand that those are more long-term issues, but we're looking at the economy in terms of short-term solutions, and then after the conflict is over, hopefully soon, how we build back Ukraine. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
So a lot of topics to unpack in both of those questions.
Should we flip a coin and see who goes first? Well, those were quite a few questions here. On the humanitarian front, speaking for the United States, we've since the invasion of Ukraine, we've committed close to $3 billion in humanitarian assistance. President Biden just recently announced another $5.5 billion, I think, going into that. We are the largest contributor to the World Food Program. So we've been very much involved with these kinds of issues from the near-term humanitarian perspective. But looking farther out, we know we can look at World Food Program budgets going back 10, 15 years and see that they were a small fraction of what they are today. And we see that the deficit that the head of the World Food Program, Beasley, is saying that they're projecting for this year exceeds the budget from last year. So this is a trend that is not sustainable in any way, and that points us to the fact that we have to balance out the humanitarian aid with longer-term assistance. We in the United States have a Feed the Future program, which to date is concentrating on 12 countries. That's probably going to be, we'll announce an expansion of that program quite soon. And interestingly enough, one of the metrics for that program's success, where we judge success or lack of it, is childhood stunting. When I joined the Board for International Food and Agricultural Development some years ago, and we were very much involved with the Feed the Future program. And thinking about it then, I thought, well, gosh, I can't really come up with a better metric, because if you can reduce the incidence of childhood stunting, you've done something in the food system measurably. We got 60 million children under the age of 5 who are stunted. I don't even know how to get my head around that kind of issue. So we're involved in that regard, and we're also working with multilateral institutions to help with financing of the countries that are in trouble because of the economic downturn that they're experiencing. We're working on fertilizer, both to increase the efficiency of fertilizer use in developing countries, but also try to make more available. It's a particular problem for Africa, I have to admit, in part because at least the mineral fertilizers have to be shipped a long way. So there are a lot of issues and a lot of complexity, which I won't get into, but I think at least in U.S. government, and I know I can speak for the State Department, we've been viewing this as an all hands on deck moment. It's discussions about Russia, Ukraine, what's going on there to protect their sovereignty, protect their democracy, always have a component of food security in the talks.
That's an amazing number, 60 million children.
Yes.
Yeah, sad. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just on a humanitarian front, to pick the two most topical examples, the EU, for example, announced a recent package of 1.6 billion euro in assistance for the Sahel Lake Chad region, which is undergoing this long-term drought, and a further 600 million for the Horn of Africa. But we know and accept and are on record that the ultimate solution is to improve and increase production capacity in these countries and globally, but to do it in a sustainable manner, because in the context of what we're discussing, namely Ukraine, we cannot lose sight also of the existential threat presented to global food production by climate change. And so you'll find it in all the fora, and I like to think that the European Union is pushing it very hard, that we really need to push on both solidarity with developing countries in providing immediate humanitarian aid, but perhaps even more importantly, in increasing their production capacity. President von der Leyen, even in the last few days, made a very important point that Europe has no ambition to feed the world. We don't want that developing countries are reliant on us to keep them fed. We want to help them to feed themselves. Mm-hmm. And whether it's G7, G20, FAO, WFP, UN, all are very firmly sold on that challenge. But again, it's not going to be done in a month, it's not going to be done in a year, it's a multi-year challenge.
You both bring up something that prompts another question, and then we'll go to our audience question over here. But if we're talking about excessive resources, both financial, the time, the transportation, trying to solve these things over a multi-year period, how do we keep the political will interested in a longer-term solution, helping countries be more sustainable in their food production? Your thoughts on how we can keep people saying, yes, these are still the best use of our taxpayer dollars or European resources?
Well, I think because ultimately everybody benefits. Nobody benefits by leaving any part of the world exposed to major food shortages or outright famine. The consequences are felt globally. So essentially it serves our own interests by actively and constructively engaging with these countries to bring up their production. Otherwise, frankly, it also becomes our problem. And so this, I think it's fully justified on moral, ethical, economic, political, security considerations. It ticks all those boxes.
All the boxes. Mm-hmm.
Well, Sarah, I think your question raises a concern that we all have to have. We're aware that everyone in the public can get concerned about food security when we see starving people on TV, and when we see something like the invasion of Ukraine. We do have to be worried that people's attention might not be permanently fixed on those questions, and we are taking a number of tacks in the U.S. government to try to address that. Our Secretary of State, when the U.S. was chairing the UN Security Council, had a special session of the UN Security Council on food security. We've had ministerial meetings. We've done a lot at the government level to keep this going. I think it's also important for us to get the message out that, as Michael said, if you want to speak about self-interest, I don't particularly want to do that too much, and when we're talking about trying to build a global food security, but there is a self-interest in this. The U.S. Agency for International Development a few years back commissioned a study by the International Food Policy Research Institute about the benefits to the U.S. economy, to U.S. agriculture from our investments in foreign agricultural research. And the investment was, the cost-benefit ratio was fantastic. I forget the exact number, but I want to say 30-1, something like that. So research that helps developing countries improve production, that helps develop better, higher yielding, let's say drought-tolerant varieties of our commodities. There are 16 million acres in Africa now planted with drought-tolerant maize that was developed by the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Mexico, which is supported by the United States and by European countries. Those kinds of things also pay dividends locally. So this is not simply a question of being charitable. It's a question, our work has to be predicated on the realization that we have a common future.
Thank you. Kwe, I have a questioner right here. If you could stand, please, and give us your name and your organization.
Khalisa Shafirdieva. I work for World Bank. I want to just follow up the already Mr. Commissioner told about the solidarity, particularly we now living in the area of the climate change. I want to ask what's the EU and the US common policy support and support the developing countries in terms of the applying for new technology, whereas they're lacking like the water resource and the access to the new technology and the seeds that they just need to build their agriculture in a resilient way. The second question is that back to 2013, I was in part of mission to US. And we were in Carnegie Center, and it was discussion about the EU-US trade negotiation. And the key challenge issues related to human rights and the access to healthy food. And generally, the concern mainly was the EU part. And since 9 years, almost 9 years passed since that, and my question is that have you find the ground, like common ground, to move this process forward, and in terms of the like food production also support each other and your both efforts? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. I'm afraid that's going to have to be our last one, but I'm interested in your responses on what we're doing to provide technology and address climate change and food processing.
Mm-hmm. Well, the quick answer is quite a lot, and there's a tremendous amount of research going on in U.S. universities. We realize that if our crops do not adapt to climate change, then neither will we. And one of my concerns, personal concerns, is that we're making assumptions about how well our crops and the institutions behind them are ready for the kind of climates that we have today. We're headed towards climates which in some parts of the world haven't been seen since the Neolithic time, in other words, in the history of agriculture. And I do question whether we realize how difficult in some cases it's going to be for our crops to adapt to those kind of new climates, particularly the crops for which there either is not much or any involvement of the private sector, and for which there are no plant breeders. We have to be thinking about the avenue towards adaptation for those kinds of crops. And they're grown on hundreds of millions of acres in the world and provide a lot of food security. So I think we have our work cut out for us. I think we have to question some of our assumptions that we're making, and we have to make the kind of long-term investments in agricultural research that will help our crops become adapted to climate change. They don't do that magically. They do that because we help them to do it.
Absolutely. Mr. Scannell, you have the last word.
Yeah. Well, in Europe, we have our so-called Green Deal and Farm to Fork, which are aimed at ensuring that our agriculture becomes more sustainable moving forward and that it reduces massively inputs. But to meet that challenge, we've also identified that we need to hugely invest in research and innovation to basically find alternatives to move in this more sustainable direction. And that investment is taking place. Just as one small example, under our so-called Horizon Europe, we'll be investing $9 billion in so-called natural resources, primarily food, agriculture, to basically give our farmers the technologies to face up to these challenges. And there's a very important EU-US dimension to this also. We have a whole range of initiatives, some of which I will be discussing with counterparts in USDA and USTR over the next few days. We have a collaborative platform on agriculture. We have a Trade and Technology Council. And on the agendas of all these different formations, we include how we cooperate on innovation to help ourselves individually and mutually to face up to these challenges. So personally, I'm very optimistic that basically we're singing from the same hymn sheet on the crucial importance of innovation to meeting these challenges.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry to say our time has run out here, but please join me in thanking our experts for this discussion. And I know we're going to move on to an exciting part of the rest of your day here as part of this session. So thank you very much.